Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Vendor Financial Red Flags Your Credit Union Should Watch For webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Raman Zachariah, VendMinder's Chief Financial Officer. He will discuss red flags to watch for related to a vendor's financial health so you can take appropriate action to reduce that risk at your credit union. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our 3 vendor financial statements to review infographic, the importance of vendor and supplier financial performance ebook, vendor financial health monitoring, warning signs to watch out for infographic, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Raman. Raman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessie. Hey, everyone. It's great to be speaking with you all today, and we're going to go through some awesome content to hopefully provide some insight into some of the red flags that you should be looking for when performing financial health reviews on your vendors. So in today's agenda, we'll focus on 3 key areas. 1, why vendor financial reviews are important and what to review in these financial reviews. 2, understanding the impact of what we're going to call the domino effect and how to manage around it. And finally, 3, being aware of common red flags and what you can do to mitigate risks. So before we maybe dive into that first part of the agenda, let's actually get an understanding of why vendor financial reviews are important. So as we'll talk about today, and as many of you may already be aware, financial risk is a lot deeper than just the numbers. I like to call this a combination of looking at things from a very quantitative and qualitative perspective, or even using the analogy of describing it's a little bit of art and it's a little bit of science. From a perspective of making it practical for your teams, and what we'll talk about from a red flag perspective, if you discover something like a vendor performing or underperforming from a financial point of view and lacking things like liquidity or being unprofitable, that's a quantitative aspect of their business that shows that they may have a high likelihood of issues or may actually result in them making some cost cuts that could have issues on their servicing levels. So as you start to see those types of red flags, that could ultimately impact your credit union and your customers as well, because it has a domino effect on your organization. Again, something that we'll talk about in depth a bit later. So it's important to do financial reviews on these vendors because it helps expose the vendor's ability to sustain its operations and provide the services and solutions that they've contracted to you and other customers to provide. So let's dig a little bit more about why vendor financial health today is an important activity more than ever. From the point of view of why vendor financial health is more important than ever in today's evolving environment, there's a number of different things we can point to. It almost feels like every other day there's a lot of news that's coming out in and around the landscape we're seeing, whether it's a pandemic and its lasting impact on credit union environment and overall the business environment, whether it's the business environment that's centered around inflation and cost increases or supply chain pressures and challenges that we've seen that remain, or even more recently with what's going on in the banking industry that we'll talk a little bit about, and certainly we have a ton of content on and we've talked about at length. Financial health tends to be at the forefront of all these things and also tends to be an important piece of the due diligence puzzle when you're doing deep dive insight into what type of relationship you want to have with a vendor and ultimately whether or not you want to continue that relationship with that vendor. So use these financial health reviews to ultimately get a better understanding of what you can do in these challenging macroeconomic environments and ultimately what you can control, because a lot of these things ultimately are out of your control, but you can use financial health reviews to identify risks and insert controls and mitigations around them based on a vendor's financial health profile. Additionally, it's just one more piece of an overall puzzle. So obviously, third-party risk management involves a lot of people internally and a lot of different internal controls and due diligence and follow-ups to that due diligence that you'll be doing. But don't view it within a narrow lens or within a silo. So keep in mind that financial health reviews, although they're very important in and of themselves, they actually are very understood when you put other things across your due diligence program together with them and you involve and cross-collaborate with certain parts of your credit union and your risk management organization internally. So get ahead of doing them and look to use these financial health reviews in context with other things you're implementing and putting forth within your third-party risk management program. So to dive in, we talked about a little bit about why financial health reviews are important, but now let's talk about what you want to collect as a credit union performing financial due diligence on a vendor. Again, going back to that notion that I just talked about a couple slides ago in terms of the quantitative and qualitative aspects of what financial health reviews entail, here are some pieces of information you'll want to capture on both of those realms. First, you'll want to get the 3 common statements that most companies have and vendors should have access to and provide to you as it is available. Those are the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. You want to get at least 2 to 3 years of those pieces of information, and ideally they come in the form of an audit because that's tend to be looked at as a gold standard. If you can't get an audit because either the vendor isn't audited or they don't want to provide that information, you can ask them for company prepared or unaudited financials. That obviously comes with some limitations and maybe some lack of completeness, but nevertheless, they can be used to perform your reviews. On the qualitative side, you'll want to get things like management discussion and analysis, which is just further context behind some of the quantitative figures, as well as any sort of third-party letters or any sort of rating information that the vendor may have access to that is not necessarily available in the public domain. And we can talk a little bit about the dynamics of working with a public and a private vendor as well, and how to do the same types of reviews and collect the same type of information in varying degrees with those different vendors in the landscape. So digging in a little bit on the quantitative side, because this is where some of most of the work will be centered around, at least up front, when you're doing and starting your financial health reviews at your credit union, or trying to implement some improvements to some of your reviews as you're trying to add some additional horsepower and professionalization behind what you're already doing today. So those 3 financial statements we talked about on the previous slide, the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement, each provide a varying level and a differing level of information. And you should use them in context to each other as opposed to just looking at them independently. Again, in an ideal world, you get all 3. And you'll get multiple periods of all 3, so you can perform trended analysis in some more detail over a period of time. That's just beyond that 1 year or that few months or quarter you have. But being able to look at each of them and understand the purpose of each of them is critical. So from an income statement perspective, this basically tells us and tells your credit union and the team members behind it from a financial health review how the vendor generates revenue, how it invests in its business via its investment in teams and its costs and operating expenses, and how it drives profitability or lack thereof. The balance sheet, on the other end of the spectrum, is something of what the vendor shows how much liquidity it has or how much liquidity it needs to generate in the future. So you want to focus a lot on cash and liquidity within that, and with that comes assets and liabilities. So you want to look at debt loads and things of that nature in the balance sheet we can talk a little bit more about. And on a cash flow statement, you want to see how the vendor makes or uses its cash. So again, cash is king. On the balance sheet is ultimately where that cash is displayed as of a point in time, but within the cash flow statement, you actually can see some of the activities from an operation side, from a financing side, and from an investing side to where they generate or use their cash, which is important context when looking at the other two statements on top of the cash flow statement. Digging a little bit more into the income statement, you can actually see a bit of a deep dive here that we'll try to summarize for you in so many words. From a vendor's income statement, we want to look at key trends and try to scrutinize those trends within the context of, again, of understanding how the vendor makes revenue and how it makes money, and how efficient that vendor is in generating profit from the money they make from revenue from these customers. The overall value of an income statement at a summary level is that it's a good indicator of the vendor's overall financial performance and ability to generate sufficient revenue and obviously profitability through its operations. This is a good starting framework and a good statement to start the foundation of a lot of your financial health reviews that dovetails nicely into what you will learn and use from the rest of the financial statements, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement that we'll talk about here. Again, wanting to reiterate, as you'll see in a common pattern, on an income statement basis, you want to try to collect at least 12 months, but ideally you get multiple years, so 24 or 36 months, so you can perform some sort of trended review. And if you're going to take away a few items and input in your credit union, the three metrics to focus on are revenue, profitability, and profitability can come from gross profit, operating profit, EBITDA, or net income, and the margins, which is effectively the factors of gross profit margin, operating profit margin, and net income margin. So those are some of the key pieces of information from an income statement you'll want to extract when you're performing your reviews. Pivoting now to the balance sheet, the second of the three financial statements to review, I want to reiterate again the context of why you want to review a balance sheet on vendors and how it can be used and its importance in your overall program and instituting these financial health reviews. So the balance sheet helps answer what the vendor's financial position is at any given point of time as of a single point in time. So what this helps expose to you and your credit union and the rest of your third-party risk management program is how stable or how unstable a vendor is as of a point in time and how much it has in liquidity as well as how much it can generate in liquidity based on its assets and liabilities profile. So overall value essentially will help show to you whether or not the vendor has sufficient or insufficient capital, cash, and assets to meet its obligations and liabilities either currently or in the future. So we need to pay attention to all those things together and put them side by side again with the first statement we reviewed in the income statement to understand its full context. Similarly, in terms of what you want to look for from a balance sheet, you'll want to get at least 12 months of information on this front. Again, that will be one balance sheet worth. But ideally, you want to ask for 2 to 3 years of balance sheets so that you can look at the overall trend of things like cash, liquidity, total assets, total liabilities, and obviously the components therein like current assets, short-term debt, total debt, and retained earnings on the equity side. Again, these are ideal scenarios. If you can only get 12 months, it's still okay, but keep that in mind. You should always ask for more and settle with less based upon what you want to design your program around and your reviews around. Finally, the third statement that we'll dig a little bit deeper into that we've already talked about a bit is the cash flow statement. So from a cash flow statement point of view, its context and why it's important to you in your credit union and the third-party risk management program is really to give you additional visibility into how and in what activities the vendor utilizes to generate cash or uses cash. It provides you insight into things like its cash flow from operations, its main normal course business activities. It also provides you context into the investments the vendor is making outside of its normal course operations. So if they're investing in any sort of capital assets or long-term investments in the form of cash flow from investing. And finally, also from its financing capabilities and how it generates cash from external or other forms of financing like debt or equity capital, and whether it also pays those sources down over time, which is obviously critical for something like a debt instrument or a term loan. So the combination of those three items, the cash flow from operations, cash flow from investing, and cash flow from financing, sums up to net cash, which ultimately ties back to the balance sheet and helps ultimately provide that context into, does the vendor generate cash from its various parts of his business, or does it use cash? Again, as you guys have seen on prior pages, you always want to get at least 12 months of information on cash flow statements, but ideally you should ask for 2 years or 3 years worth, again, to perform that trending. So to summarize again what I said on the prior slide, you'll want to focus on operating, investing, and financing activities, and ultimately get some additional context on their sources and uses of cash and how that cash ultimately funnels down to the balance sheet. So here at VendMinder, we obviously perform a number of financial health assessments for our clients and the vendors that they do business with. But the takeaway is you can use and ultimately take away a lot of the information from those quantitative 3 statements we just walked through and put them together in deliverables in a repeatable format, regardless of whether or not you use a service like VendMinders or you have something that is in-house that you develop and utilize either through spreadsheets or some sort of deliverable and approach you've created. At the end of the day, the quantitative information within the balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow statement and the corresponding ratios we talked about that come from those statements are critical to help serve as the baseline foundation for what you're doing within your financial health assessment. But they're only one of those pieces of puzzles which requires that layer of qualitative interpretation and ultimately some of those conclusions and commentary items and takeaways you'll want to be cognizant of and utilize within your reviews. So at the end of the day, take the quantitative information we just talked about and try to build upon it and build the story with that foundational information. But you'll want to understand the key takeaway from a risk level when you're performing these financial health assessments and be able to articulate it in a concise and very thorough manner for your team members so that they have an understanding of the puts and takes as it pertains to a vendor's financial health over the period you're reviewing. So we previewed how some of the qualitative and commentary information, as well as obviously the quantitative information that's directly extracted from those 3 financial statements, can be used to form a picture of a vendor's financial health. But we didn't really talk in depth about those key ratios that you pull from those quantitative financial statements we just went over on the preceding section. So let's actually dive a little bit into some of the key ratios that help identify some of those red flags you should look for when performing these financial health assessments and financial reviews. Again, these are all found and calculated from common metrics and information that is extracted from the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. And these are not obviously all encompassing, but feel free to use these as a list of best practices and at least some minimum inputs as you're maturing your program or starting your program as it pertains to financial health reviews. A few to consider that we'll talk about here are current ratio, which is a sense of short-term liquidity, and that's found by dividing the current assets number from the balance sheet by the current liabilities number in the balance sheet. As a rule of thumb, you want this number generally to be above 1. If it's not above 1, that might indicate some red flags. Another one that's worth mentioning here is gross profit margin. That is total gross profit divided by total revenue, and it is extracted from the income statement. This ultimately shows how profitable a company is after deducting its direct costs attributable to servicing that revenue and can be a good indication to start from before digging into the rest of the operating expenditure part of the business when you're reviewing a financial profile of a particular vendor. Others are obviously important that we haven't highlighted here, but certainly you can use those and implement those as you see fit, above and beyond some of the ones listed here. Additionally, now that we kind of got a sense of some of the things you want to extract using the information, you should take a step back and ask a few questions when evaluating the key statements and some of the key commentary as well from these financial statements and from some of the quantitative and qualitative pieces of data you've extracted. So as you're reading through the documents and as you're summarizing them, you should ask yourself and try to comment on your assessments with some of these questions, such as, is the vendor making money? Does the vendor have sufficient capital access to capital to support their ongoing operations? What is the vendor's total debt to net worth? What is the total tangible net worth of the vendor? Can the vendor continue operations with its current cash levels? And then finally, what are some of the important qualitative items beyond some of those quantitative metrics and points of view that provide additional context and information on that vendor's overall financial health? Make sure you ask yourself these and perhaps have answers to them in your comment section as we went over 2 slides ago, and also as feedback when you're getting questions from your examiners, your auditors, or other internal team members as well. From a qualitative point of view, you'll want to focus a lot of your time and your efforts on some of the things that are most material to a vendor's overall financial health profile. There's an abundance of information within our annual reports and financial documentation. So you don't want to get yourself drowning in data and information that's not usually relevant for you, but here are some examples of some key qualitative disclosures you should look for across all of your vendor reviews as it pertains to financial health. A going concern opinion is usually provided by a third-party reputable firm or an auditor that ultimately says that the vendor is able to remain in operations with its current liquidity profile based on the information review, aka they will be a going concern. Other things like subsequent events are found in that audited report, so keep an eye out at the end of those audit reports for those, because they can tell you some material events that the auditor and the company have disclosed. Other things like their legal or litigation issues, any sort of adverse media disclosures that you can maybe get even from the public domain are important. And then other things like whether or not they have any sort of concentration or notable concentration between suppliers and customers can help provide some additional context above and beyond some of the information you've seen in an income statement, balance sheet, or cash flow statement. So keep an eye out for all of these. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but definitely some of the things you should start with at a minimum. So let's pause and go into that first poll question, and I'll pass it over to Jesse.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your vendor financial review include a review of all 3 documents? Yes, we review an income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow statement. No, we only review some of the documents. No, we don't review an income statement, balance sheet, or cash flow statement, or not sure. Ram, it looks like we have some time to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, how frequently should we perform financial health reviews or assessments?
Thank you, Jesse, and a great and common question for you all that we'll cover throughout the presentation, but just to reiterate it for you all while you're asking it. On an annual cadence is usually the preferred method and the preferred timeline in order to do this. I think we centered it around the audited financials being released if the company is audited, which is usually the gold standard, as we'll talk about. But if you have a more regular frequency, like a quarterly or monthly cadence, especially if you're dealing with a vendor that you know is vulnerable or may have issues or red flags, you can always increase the frequency and work with the vendor hand in hand to make sure you're getting regular updates and documentation and responses to some of the red flags you've identified and some of the things you're doing with them to manage their risk. So at a minimum on an annual basis, but you can always do it more regularly as your program design allows for.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. And a quick reminder before we move on with the presentation, in the related content widget, you'll find our 3 vendor financial statements to review infographic. This infographic discusses 3 vendor financial statements that give you better insight into the risk you may be facing. Back to you, Raman.
Thank you, Jesse. So at the beginning of this presentation, I made the mention of the domino effect as the kind of key header for the second part of the agenda, and now we'll actually dig right into what the domino effect means from a financial performance and financial health point of view, and the impacts it could have on your business. So as this neat graphic shows to you, the domino effect starts with any sort of key indicators from a financial performance point of view that shows declining performance or some sort of issues from financial health point of view. And from that usually results in other dominoes following thereafter. So those types of income declines or profitability declines means that there's going to be subsequent cost cuts, which means that those cost cuts will lead to less focus and less staff to address your service levels, which will lead to declining response times and issues for your credit union and your credit union's customers based on the service that this vendor has contracted to provide to you. So this domino effect can be very critical, and you want to get ahead of it by identifying a lot of the red flags we'll talk about here, and we've already talked about a bit in some of the preceding slides. So you may be asking how to avoid the domino effect or how to get ahead of it. So here are some ways to get ahead of it and where you can start today. You'll want to prioritize and doing your financial reviews on key vendors or critical vendors. So however you define criticality, focus your time and efforts to start on those vendors. From there, you'll want to define a regular cadence of performing these financial health reviews on these vendors and try to collect enough documentation to get insight into their financial profile. You'll want to also create a consistent approach, so create questionnaires and due diligence request lists to compile this information. Keep it also at your fingertips and make sure that it's fully auditable and traceable so that others on your team can check the work and also auditors and examiners can be aware of it. And then from there, you also want to get an understanding, if you don't already have a methodology or a deliverable, you want to craft it and create it and have other stakeholders organizationally agree upon it. And then from there, you can essentially involve others that you see fit are necessary to the component. We'll talk about a little bit of how that cross-collaboration should work on the next slide. But one thing to note is it's always best to not wait for regulatory guidance or a regulatory body to tell you what to do. You want to get ahead and be proactive with a lot of what you do. So there's really no perfect time and really there's no ideal scenario with doing these types of reviews. You just have to kind of get in and define those for you and create a repeatable approach that all of you can exercise and build upon. So always try to get ahead of that and get ahead of the financial red flags that exist so you can essentially avoid that domino effect that could hinder your operations and your customers' operations. So as I mentioned, financial health reviews are a cross-collaborative effort, so you'll want to get a lot of different parts of your organization at least tangentially involved in defining what you want to accomplish with your financial health reviews and ultimately helping your subject matter experts or people either from a third-party risk management program leadership perspective on the ground doing these reviews or being in charge of the processes. So starts with really management and getting their tone at the top and defining their risk appetite and having that really blend into what you're trying to do from a review process financially and also across the rest of your credit unions, third-party risk management program, due diligence activities. From there, you'll obviously want to involve folks like subject matter experts, accounting and operations personas that will help provide additional context, horsepower, and capacity that will actually do the financial assessments or will be important in designing them and reviewing them and queuing them as well. You'll want, if you do have a vendor management team, to collect the documentation and really manage some of the relationship part of this, as well as the communication to and from the vendor and any sort of remediation that needs to be put forth. And then finally, you'll obviously want your compliance team or risk management team to outline the risks and understand the risks within the context of the rest of the program you have and the other things you do from a due diligence perspective, and see if there are other things that need to be done and redesigned across the organization, some of the earlier departments and earlier steps in the process. So again, very much a cross-collaborative effort. You may be a smaller credit union, and this may not necessarily be fully applicable to you. You may wear many of these hats. So keep these in mind. It's good to compartmentalize them, but it doesn't mean that all organizations are built the same. So there might be some bleed over in terms of some of the responsibilities. But again, always good to view it in a cross-collaborative effort to avoid and get around the domino effect that we talked about. So from the perspective of what you can do to make it a bit easier to cross-collaborate, or if you're one of those credit unions where you wear many hats, you may be one person or two people that wear all 6 of the hats on the prior page, this becomes even more important in terms of centralizing and documenting your processes and procedures. So without proper documentation, you may have things fall through the cracks, and you may have issues with your regulatory bodies and compliance needs that are put forth as an operating credit union by many of the key parties internally, if it's your compliance team, or externally from regulators. So having a system, tool, or set of processes documented is great, and also having a central location where you can kind of tap into these and an audit trail is also important as you think about the full context of performing due diligence and having the follow-ups and mitigation plans in place so that you can execute on your financial health review takeaways. So keep these all in mind when you're executing on these workflows, akin to any other workflow that your credit union manages from a third-party risk management program perspective. Additionally, there is no one right tool or one right process, but there's best practices that we've obviously talked about here, and I'm sure that you all have. So keep in mind that things like spreadsheets and Excel is always a great place to start. Again, you don't want to wait for a regulatory body to help guide you. You should get started as soon as possible and start small. It's always good to start simple and small. And then from there, you can always mature based upon the capacity investment your team has and whether or not your credit union has other folks they can pull in to help you out. So start small and move forward from that. And again, it can be something as simple as a PDF document or some sort of Word document that you've agreed upon, and you can roll out across the critical vendors, and then from there, roll it across the rest of your vendor base and future vendor base. So we'll pause and go into the second poll question of the day, and I'm going to pass it over to Jesse to help prep that one for you all. Thank you.
Our second poll question of the day is, how do you manage and monitor your vendor's financial health? By spreadsheets or in-house tools, with specific software or technology? You outsource to a third-party service provider? None of the above, or none currently is used? Raman, I think we have another question here that we could go ahead and answer. And this question is, at which stage of the vendor lifecycle should we conduct financial reviews?
Thank you again for passing it over, Jesse, and thank you all for the question. As it pertains to the overall vendor risk management lifecycle, you want to focus your financial health reviews in the onboarding phase as well as the ongoing phase. Particularly, especially when you're dealing with a new vendor, you want to make sure that when you're vetting them and when you're doing your onboarding, you perform your standard financial reviews and your financial health assessments, because it's important to get a good sense of what the starting risk will be and what you ultimately can do pre-contract if you need to insert some sort of language into the agreement as it pertains to their financial health on a regular cadence. On an ongoing basis in that latter phase of the vendor life cycle, You want to make sure to do these, as we talked about earlier, at least on an annual cadence. But if you need to move up your regularity of doing this financial review or doing financial health assessments, you can always consider doing them on a quarterly or monthly basis. So all in all, you want to focus most of your time on the onboarding phase and the vetting phase, as well as obviously from an ongoing maintenance basis. Back over to you, Jesse. Thank you.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I'd like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget again, where you will find our The Importance of Vendor and Supplier Financial Performance ebook. This ebook is a helpful resource as it explains further the importance of financial health and performance of vendors and suppliers. Okay, Raman, let's continue with the presentation.
So on the last couple sections of today's presentation, before our third poll question and then some concluding thoughts, we'll want to focus some time on talking a little bit more about the red flags, but also how to make some of your financial health reviews actionable, simple, and useful across your credit union. Again, I've noted this notion of highest and best use of your time and the best bang for your buck. So where do you want to focus if you have limited time, and how it can be lasting and provide a lasting impact for your credit union that could be strapped for time doing other things across your due diligence programs internally. So some of the takeaways are focusing on things like going concern. So this again is a view either by an auditor or by the company itself that they have enough liquidity to sustain operations and capital to sustain operations over at least a 15-month or even a 12-month view in certain circumstances. So that helps provide at least some comfort that they will not be interrupted, and therefore your operations and your customers' operations will not be interrupted by service level issues or any sort of service interruptions. You also want to focus some time on material changes and trends. So again, this is why some of the information is always good to be gathered over a multiple period view, if possible. And getting any sort of disclosures on subsequent events is also important there, as we've talked about in the past. And then finally, if you want to be even most to the point and very simple with your approach, you want to just focus on a vendor's ability to make money, and if it does make money or not, and whether or not the vendor has sufficient capital to support their ongoing operations. So again, remember, especially in this environment, cash is king. And if the vendor isn't able to generate cash either through revenue or even through profitability, or doesn't have access to cash, they may not be able to service you and their other customers. So keep that in mind across all of the simplicity that you're trying to gather with your financial health review process. Beyond those simple tips and best practices, here are some additional tools and processes you can do above and beyond just looking at their annual reports, such as their audit, or if they're a public company, their 10K or their 10Qs if they're on a quarterly cadence. You can use the public environment from an adverse media or just general PR environment on the vendor to get a sense of any sort of disclosures that might be qualitative in nature that support some of the quantitative data you've extracted or gotten directly from the vendor or through their information. You can also interact directly with the vendor in a common cadence, either on a quarterly cadence or on an annual cadence at a minimum, and understand about how their performance is, among other things you'll ask them in your questionnaire process and due diligence process. In that, you can start to ask them for updated information. You can also ask them for any new information if you want to just focus on the material changes. And then you'll also want to use that to perhaps look at refreshing or getting a refresh or a better understanding of the relationship you have with the vendor. So if you believe that you need to do something with their contract, or you want to add a new SLA or a provision or requirement, look to use these touch points to perhaps revisit those holistically. So all things considered, these are some additional tools you can use behind some of the other quantitative and qualitative work you would get from either the annual reports or from a letter or some sort of disclosures that the vendor makes available to you in your overall due diligence process. So as I mentioned previously on contracts and how you can use the financial health reviews on a regular cadence to help revisit the agreements you've put into place with these vendors. Looking at how these two weave together is always critical and sometimes overlooked because not everyone always pays attention to that original agreement or those amended agreements within the context of financial health. So because of that domino effect and those downstream issues that may result as a vendor's financial profile deteriorates, you want to perhaps use your contracts as a way to protect your credit union upfront and be able to enforce certain SLAs or actions you have agreed upon or were able to get in writing within your agreement. So performing regular reviews can help expose to you what you should consider redoing within not only this existing vendor relationship, but future vendor relationships for similar service providers or all service providers you deal with at your credit union. So make sure you get an understanding of those key impactful areas that we talked about. So the understanding of their trends, the understanding of things like what the vendor is doing from a qualitative point of view and a qualitative disclosure, and use those to revamp your contractual language and SLAs and some of the things that you can perhaps execute and enforce on if need be. So always view your contracts as another layer of protection above and beyond some of your risk mitigation strategies and things that you find as a result of your due diligence efforts. Digging a little bit more into SLAs, and again, within the context of financial health reviews, we often get a question of what happens when you don't put enough emphasis on these SLAs or you don't really know where to start. So put simply, your service level agreements, your SLAs, are your best course of action and can be used to get out of a contract or get some sort of penalty or recourse. So make sure you're very clear on those and make them tailored to specific things that you have from a managerially defined risk appetite of your overall third-party risk management program. So the contract obviously gets a ton of review by different stakeholders, again, in that cross-collaborative effort as we talked about a little bit before, but we don't always look at things like financial health within the context of these contract reviews. So make sure you're at least taking a step back and thinking about financial health and inserting certain language as it pertains to the vendor providing you something like their financial audit every year as part of an SLA or a contractual requirement, or a vendor perhaps even maintaining a certain level of liquidity as another SLA or some sort of proof that they need to provide to you, just as an added layer of protection. So you don't always have to consider them, but especially for your critical vendors, you'll want to have as much protection as possible. So keep that in mind when you're not only writing and negotiating your contracts, but also, again, when you're looking to renew or refresh the contracts on a go-forward basis, because it gives you the opportunity to reflect the latest and greatest and help perhaps save you a lot of time on the back end dealing with some of the domino effects that may affect your credit union. So we'll go right into the third poll question, and I'll pass it over to Jesse to kick us off. Jesse?
Our next poll question is, does your executive management team regularly review SLA compliance? Yes, no, or not sure. Raman, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And this question is, what are some specific SLAs or contractual language we can consider related to financial health reviews?
Thanks again, Jesse. Another great question as we give you guys some guidance around what you can be doing within your contracts as it pertains to financial health reviews. When you're looking to either renew a contract with a vendor and want to put some emphasis on financial health reviews being something you want to consider contractually, or if you're actually just entering into a new agreement with a particular group of vendors or a vendor, you want to look to insert any sort of ability to audit the vendor and inquire about any of their financial performance or financial information. So looking to include any sort of requirements of them providing you certain documentation, be it their financial audit or being a letter from their executive team or CFO, would be something to consider inserting within your contract. Another thing is you could also consider certain KPIs, key performance indicators, or metrics that they must have. So at a minimum, you want them to have a certain amount of liquidity or a going concern opinion, which essentially means they have enough capital to remain in operations for at least the next 12 to 18 months. So again, typically if you can get that financial audit, that going concern opinion will be in there. But if they're not an audited entity, you can always look to insert some sort of contractual language as it pertains to them having enough liquidity or being able to prove to you that they have enough liquidity to remain in operations for them to service your contract and other contracts. Back over to you, Jesse.
Here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. And I'd like to mention that you'll find our vendor financial health monitoring warning signs to watch out for infographic. This infographic walks you through warning signs to watch for as you evaluate financial risk. Raman, I'll pass it back to you.
So to conclude today's presentation, we'll want to focus on some red flags to monitor today and going forward with vendors, and end with some best practices and concluding thoughts. So a couple of red flags we've talked about very briefly, but just to reiterate, to leave you with. You want to look at across both the quantitative information and qualitative information, again, to get the best bang for your buck while you leave this presentation and go and try to implement and institute some of these changes in your own organization and your credit union. You'll want to look for continued declines in revenue and volume. You'll also want to look at continued negative cash flow or liquidity issues. You'll want to look at another red flag, which is its reliance, the vendor's reliance on any sort of external funding sources to sustain operations, and its lack of profitability, given its inability to manage either losses in revenue or inability to manage its costs. And then on the qualitative side, as I've discussed, any sort of breach of covenants, either from a financial or debt point of view, are important to look for, and any sort of increased customer or supplier churn, or even concentration, again, as we talked about earlier on some of those qualitative disclosures that are important to review. So keep all of these red flags in mind today, and use your financial health reviews to monitor these on an ongoing, at least on an annual cadence, as well as any sort of ongoing monitoring tools that you have in place to protect your organization and your credit union from any sort of financial risk that may arise. Now that you have some of these red flags at your fingertips and kind of at the top of your mind, what are some regular best practices that you can institute and implement beyond just doing a financial health review and obviously documenting and some of the other things we talked about earlier in terms of centralizing the information and having a cross-collaborative effort? So to reiterate some of these best practices and things you got to keep in mind, and perhaps something to institute as a takeaway from this presentation today, are looking at whether or not you've performed a financial health assessment on a regular basis. It's good to start doing financial assessments on vendors, but don't stop there after you've done it once. You've got to keep it fresh, because financial health can evolve over time. So you want to stay on top of that. Additionally, you want to get ahead of the domino effect. So are you pointing to, or are you evaluating things that could lead to a domino effect? So keep that in mind, as we talked about at length. And then finally, always have a contingency plan in place, and ask yourself if you have a contingency plan if you don't already put one into place. And make sure that your contracts have tight language and have teeth so you can execute on them and enforce them if needed. Again, those are there to protect you and your credit union, as well as your credit union's customers. So always keep those at the forefront as an added layer of protection above and beyond other things you're doing from a due diligence program and third-party risk management mitigation program. So to finish today, here are some key takeaways I'll leave you with. And of course, we're always open to chat and answer any other questions you all may have today and beyond today. So from a point of view of some of the things we talked about today, financial health reviews are obviously a necessary and common due diligence practice that can help improve and professionalize your program internally and help mature you and your credit union's overall procedures and what you're doing from mitigating risks across different vectors of your organization. So insert these not only on your critical vendors, but across your vendor base to get a better sense of where there may be risks from a financial performance and the vendor impacting your organization and your customers from their financial performance point of view. So keep that in mind, and also make sure to incorporate those quantitative and qualitative elements we've talked at length about today and create that consistency both from a deliverable perspective as well as from a review perspective to expand upon what you may be doing today. Or if you haven't implemented something today, consider some of the best practices and some of the foundational knowledge I've given you today to really start building these into your program design. Definitely don't view financial health within a vacuum. As we talked about, it's definitely cross-collaborative and it is dependent on other parts of your third-party risk management program. So involve other stakeholders and consider other risk domains when you're doing your financial health reviews, because a domino effect may impact other parts of your organization downstream, not just limited to the office of the CFO or the accounting team, as it pertains to financials being usually concentrated in that persona's environment. And finally, as we talked about in the prior section, make sure you're aware of your contract provisions, your SLAs, and refresh those on a regular cadence as you refresh your financial health reviews as well. So make sure you have good enforcement there and be able to execute on those if need be. Use those, again, proactively, but also don't be afraid to use them reactively if you need to, either to exit the contract or get some sort of recourse. So with that, we'll conclude the presentation. It's obviously a pleasure to present to you, and I look forward to answering more of your questions today and in the future. Thank you again.
Great. Thanks so much, Raman. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Raman for his time in sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On April 4th, our fourth Party Risk What to Know webinar, and our third-party risk management bootcamp on April 18th, 19th, and 20th. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session.
Okay, Raman, this next question is, how can we complete a financial review for the privately held entities that are not willing to share their financial statement?
Thank you for the question, and thanks, Jesse. You can complete a financial review on a private company that doesn't provide you information by gathering or using any sort of public data sources that generate enough information to meet your internal needs from a financial health assessment and review perspective. So oftentimes there are some free and available resources either through the internet or you can even pay for some through Dun & Bradstreet's credit reports or CreditSafe or even other entities like Morningstar that can give you an estimate and some internal details that they've created through their products and resources. Obviously, you'll have to enter into an agreement on the latter of those that are not free in nature, but nevertheless can provide you enough visibility into certain risk signals that may be impactful for your credit union or for your team internally. From there, or alternatively to just doing your own searches, either in the free public domain or through one of those paid providers, you could also just work directly with the vendor in your other third-party risk management workflows and see if they will cooperate with answering a bit more simple or direct information or questions to provide you some of the direct information that you need. So, for instance, instead of perhaps asking them for financials, you can be more direct and ask them if they have a financial letter or a letter from their CFO or head of finance or somebody on their executive team that could perhaps provide you some insight into their financial position at any given point in time. Alternatively, you can just ask them simple questions and be direct with it, such as, do they have enough liquidity or capital to remain in operations for the next 12 to 18 months? Do they have revenue and what is their revenue? Do they have cash and what is their cash and liquidity position? These things, again, may be incomplete and may not have, it may not be ideal for your credit union and the maturation of your program if you're trying to do it across maybe some of your critical vendors, but nevertheless, it could still serve as a guidance guidance and a guidepost so you can at least check a box or at least put some sort of risk level that you can move forward with. So those are alternatives.
Great. Our next question. Often the vendors we are reviewing are in the emerging growth category and operating at a loss. What should we be looking for to ensure the entity is viable for the future?
Yeah, I saw this question come in our presentation. It's a common one that you all probably deal with, especially when working with some of the financial technology or financial software companies that are a bit younger to the space and maybe have venture capital or private equity backers. Obviously, when it pertains to a lot of younger companies that operate with a lack of profitability or operate at a loss, you really want to focus on their revenue profile and understand the dynamics of their revenue. So if they continue to grow at a high pace, typically the venture capital-backed companies don't prioritize profitability because they're trying to, A, grab market share, and B, also create innovative products for folks such as yourselves to utilize in their day-to-day operations. So as such, they've deprioritized profitability because they know that these venture capital funds and other capital sources will provide them with enough liquidity and capital to not only sustain that lack of profitability, but also maintain viability so that they can continue to capture market share and invest in their products. So when you're dealing with a vendor that's operating at a loss, try to get a full picture of their overall cash and liquidity profile. Again, cash is king. You want to focus on that because it helps provide you a lens into how sustainable the vendor's operations are, at least within the 12 to 18 month immediate period, but also beyond that. You'll obviously get some sense of who their sources of capital are if you get an understanding of that profile to be able to offset some of their lack of profits that they're generating or the losses that they're generating. And then you also want to dig into why they're generating losses. So not all lack of profitability or losses are the same. If you're seeing things like declining trends in revenue, if you're seeing high increases in costs that are seemingly unsustainable, and then you couple that with maybe some of the qualitative commentary that I pointed to you earlier in the presentation, as well as perhaps some declining trends that could point to that domino effect we talked through as well. That's a bit different from looking at perhaps a healthy business on a revenue trend that has enough liquidity on its balance sheet and access to funds via a debt solution or some sort of equity capital. So be aware of those trends like, increasing costs, declining revenue, and how they may be causing those losses, and make sure that you get at least some understanding as to how they can perhaps cover those losses through additional financing if there's no path to profitability in sight or based on what the vendor tells you. So great question, though.
Great. I think we have time for one more. How should we respond when we see a vendor has disclosed that they are a quote-unquote going concern?
Yeah, so for those, we tried to go over what a going concern means, and just to be repeated and to reemphasize this is usually a term that auditors use when evaluating a vendor's ability to remain and sustain operations. So they'll provide in their audit opinion and oftentimes a going concern opinion, meaning that in their view, based on the information that's been provided by the vendor and its overall financial profile, that they can gather that they don't have an issue seeing this vendor remaining in operations for the next year to 18 months. They do have an issue with going concern. The auditors, if the vendor is audited and you have access to that information, you will note that and you'll see it clearly, which typically means that with its current operations or based on its current trends, both from a revenue, profitability, and capital profile, that there might be risk that they may not be in operations in the next year, or may have to make material changes to offset the need for liquidity to remain in operations. So such, always rely on that opinion because they've reviewed details, but oftentimes to get around that, you can get a sense of additional information that they can provide to you to offset some of these opinions or the going concern issues. So, for instance, they may divest certain assets to generate liquidity. They may seek funding, either through capital, equity capital or debt capital, or perhaps they're making significant cost cuts. Although these things may be red flags, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, when you're dealing with someone who's a going concern, you want to see some of these trends and actions be put into place because, again, cash is king, and if they don't have cash to remain in operations, all these things don't matter. Always perhaps even look for alternative vendors at that point because it may already be too late. So keep that in mind, and again, enforce and utilize your contracts as you see fit if there's no true path to getting around this going concern issue. So another good question. Back to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Raman. Thank you. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Raman, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Raman for his time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank and online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, including financial risk. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of InMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.